The highway stretches endlessly into darkness. Mile markers blur past like forgotten memories. Behind you, civilization fades. Ahead, something waits in the void between rest stops. Tonight, we are diving deep into the loneliest roads in America, where truckers encounter things that defy explanation. These accounts come directly from long-haul drivers who spend their lives on forgotten highways, traveling through dead zones where cell signals die and the only witnesses are the stars above. Each story has been verified through logbooks, dash cam footage, and CB radio recordings that captured moments of pure terror in real time. What makes these encounters particularly authentic is that the drivers involved never sought publicity, never tried to profit from their experiences, and in most cases, only shared their stories years later after struggling with the psychological impact of what they witnessed on those dark stretches of American highway. These are not urban legends or truck stop tales passed down through generations. These are recent documented encounters with phenomena that challenge everything we understand about the lonely roads that connect our nation. Welcome to the highways where the darkness watches back. These are true horror stories. Marcus had been driving the I-80 corridor between Sacramento and Salt Lake City for nearly 12 years without incident. The route was his bread and butter, a reliable haul that kept him on the road 5 days a week and brought him home to his wife and 2 daughters every weekend. He knew every truck stop, every way station, every stretch of dangerous road where weather or wildlife made the driving treacherous. At 43 years old, he prided himself on his perfect safety record and his ability to make his deliveries on time regardless of conditions. It was approaching 3 in the morning on a moonless Tuesday in late October when he first noticed the headlights in his mirror. The highway through western Nevada was almost completely empty at this hour. Just endless black asphalt cutting through desert wasteland where nothing lived and nothing moved except the occasional tumbleweed or jackrabbit. Marcus had not seen another vehicle for over 40 minutes, which was not unusual for this stretch of road where civilization thinned to almost nothing between Winnemucca and Battle Mountain. The headlights behind him appeared suddenly, much closer than they should have been if they had been approaching gradually. One moment his mirrors showed only darkness. The next moment, a semi-truck was following perhaps 200 yards behind, matching his speed exactly at 68 miles per hour. The sudden appearance was unsettling, but Marcus told himself the other driver had simply caught up quickly while he was focused on the road ahead. Truckers often drove in informal convoys for company and safety on these lonely stretches. But something about the following truck felt wrong from the very beginning. The headlights were positioned oddly, mounted higher than normal, and casting strange shadows across the road that seemed to move independently of the vehicle creating them. The cab was completely dark, with no running lights visible, no illuminated dashboard, nothing that would indicate normal vehicle operation. The truck seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void of darkness around it that was somehow deeper and more absolute than the surrounding night. Marcus tried raising the other driver on his CB radio, cycling through all the common channels and calling out his position and direction. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through the speakers. He tried again, this time using some of the less common frequencies that experienced drivers sometimes monitored for private conversations. Still nothing but the endless hiss of empty airwaves and occasional bursts of white noise that almost sounded like whispered words in a language he could not quite understand. The following truck maintained its exact distance behind him for the next 20 miles without deviation. When Marcus accelerated to 75 miles per hour to test the other driver's intentions, the follower matched his speed immediately with impossible precision. When he slowed to 60, testing whether the other driver would pass or at least change their following distance, The shadow truck slowed in perfect synchronization, as if their vehicles were physically connected by invisible cables. The precision of the tracking was beyond human capability, requiring reflexes and coordination that suggested something other than a tired trucker fighting to stay awake on a long haul. Marcus began to feel genuine fear settling into his chest like a cold stone. In 12 years of night driving through some of the loneliest stretches of American highway, he had encountered drunk drivers, road rage incidents, mechanical failures, and dangerous weather conditions. But he had never experienced anything like the deliberate stalking behavior of the shadow truck. The vehicle behind him was not simply traveling the same route by coincidence. It was hunting him with focused intensity that suggested malicious intent. When he reached the Flying J truck stop at Elko, Marcus signaled his intention to exit and began slowing for the off-ramp with relief flooding through his body. The shadow truck remained on the highway, passing the exit at exactly the same speed Marcus had been maintaining before his decision to stop. As it passed under the truck stop's bright sodium vapor lights, Marcus caught his first clear view of the vehicle, and his relief transformed instantly into deeper horror. The cab was ancient, possibly from the 1950s or early 1960s, with a rounded design and chrome details that had not been road legal in decades. The trailer was a plain box without any company markings, logos, or identifying information of any kind. Most disturbing was that despite passing directly under lights bright enough to read a newspaper, Marcus could not see anyone sitting in the driver's seat. The cab appeared completely empty, as if the truck was driving itself through the Nevada darkness with no human guidance or control. Marcus sat in the truck stop parking lot for over an hour, drinking bitter coffee from the 24-hour restaurant and trying to calm his racing heart. He talked to other drivers about the strange encounter, describing the old truck and its impossible behavior in detail. None of them had seen a vehicle matching his description on the highway that night. One older driver suggested it might have been the ghost of a trucker killed on this stretch years ago, then laughed at his own joke while Marcus failed to find any humor in the suggestion. The truck stop's security cameras showed his rig entering the lot clearly, but when the manager reviewed the footage at Marcus's insistent request, the recording showed nothing else on the highway at the exact time when the shadow truck should have been visible passing under the lights. The digital timestamp on the video matched Marcus's memory of the encounter, but the highway appeared completely empty except for his own vehicle taking the exit. When Marcus finally felt ready to continue his route toward Salt Lake City, he pulled back onto the empty highway, with his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache. The road stretched ahead into absolute darkness, with his headlights creating a tunnel of visibility that extended perhaps 300 feet before being swallowed by the night. For 5 blessed minutes, his mirrors showed nothing but empty highway behind him. Then the headlights reappeared in his mirror, closer than before, maintaining the same impossible distance and matching his every speed change with mechanical precision that made his skin crawl with primitive fear. The shadow truck followed Marcus for the next 120 miles, through mountain passes and across empty valleys where the highway was the only sign of human presence for dozens of miles in any direction. His initial terror had evolved into something approaching despair as he realized that stopping at truck stops or rest areas only provided temporary respite before the follower inevitably returned within minutes of his departure. The thing behind him was patient, relentless, and utterly indifferent to his fear. He tried every evasion technique he could imagine during those long, dark hours, taking unexpected exits onto service roads that led to nowhere, varying his speed randomly between 50 and 80 miles per hour, even turning off his headlights briefly to see if the follower was tracking him visually or through some other supernatural means he could not comprehend. Nothing worked. the shadow truck maintained its pursuit with unwavering determination and impossible precision that defied every law of physics and probability he understood. Around 4:30 in the morning, other voices began crackling through his CB radio with reports that made his blood run even colder. A woman hauling produce from California described being followed by an old truck with no visible driver through the same stretch of Nevada highway. Her voice was shaking with barely controlled panic as she described headlights that appeared and disappeared without explanation. A team of husband and wife drivers reported seeing what looked like a phantom vehicle stalking another semi through southern Wyoming, matching the description Marcus had given earlier. The reports were spreading across multiple states, creating a wave of fear among truckers who worked the western routes and relied on their CB radios for company during the lonely night hours. Marcus noticed with growing horror that the shadow truck was gradually closing the distance between them. The gap that had been 200 yards when it first appeared was now closer to 150 yards, then 100, then 75. The approach was so gradual that he almost did not notice it happening at first. But over the course of several hours, the follower had cut the distance by more than half. At the current rate of closure, he calculated that the trucks would be touching within another 50 or 60 miles, maybe less. The realization that the shadow truck intended to make physical contact filled Marcus with a dread that went beyond rational fear into something primal and absolute. He had no idea what would happen when the vehicles touched, but every instinct screamed that allowing contact would be catastrophic and final. He pushed his rig to speeds that were dangerous and definitely illegal, ignoring the governor that was supposed to limit his maximum velocity. The shadow truck matched every increase effortlessly, as if speed and distance were meaningless concepts to whatever force was driving it through the darkness. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky with the first hints of purple and gray, Marcus was approaching the outskirts of Salt Lake City, where the highway widened from 2 lanes to 4, and early morning traffic was beginning to appear. He hoped desperately that the presence of other vehicles and the approaching daylight would force the shadow truck to abandon its pursuit. But the follower showed no signs of being deterred by the changing conditions or the witnesses who might see its impossible existence. The shadow truck was now less than 50 yards behind, close enough that Marcus could see details of its construction in his mirrors that made his mind struggle to process what his eyes were showing him. The cab looked hand-built, or perhaps grown, assembled from parts that should not fit together and could not possibly function as a unified machine. He could see seams and joints that appeared welded or bolted in configurations that defied normal mechanical engineering. Some sections looked like they were made from metal that had been melted and reformed by enormous heat. Other parts seemed organic, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own terrified heartbeat. The front grille was not a standard manufactured part from any era of truck production, but seemed to have been formed or shaped like organic tissue that had been transformed into something metallic and wrong. The headlights were positioned at angles that created impossible shadows, and as Marcus stared into his mirror with horrified fascination, he realized he could see through sections of the cab into a space that appeared larger on the inside than the outside dimensions would allow. The driver's seat remained empty, but he could sense something occupying that space, something that had no physical form, but was watching him with malevolent intelligence and patient hunger. When the first true rays of sunlight broke over the eastern mountains and touched the highway with golden light, the shadow truck began to change in ways that Marcus would never be able to adequately describe to anyone who had not witnessed it themselves. The solid darkness of its form started to waver and distort, like heat shimmer rising from summer asphalt or the air above a flame. The vehicle was becoming translucent, fading from solid matter into something ghostly and insubstantial, that seemed to exist between dimensions or states of reality. Marcus watched in his mirrors as the shadow truck became progressively more transparent with each passing second of sunrise. He could see the highway through its form, then the mountains beyond, then the sky itself showing through what had been solid metal and glass moments before. The headlights flickered like dying stars, their strange shadows evaporating into the morning light. Within 3 minutes of full sunrise, the shadow truck had vanished completely, leaving no trace of its presence except the terror etched permanently into Marcus's memory, and the desperate reports still crackling through his CB radio from other drivers who had encountered the same nightmare on different highways across the western states. Marcus completed the final miles to his delivery point in Salt Lake City in silence. No longer able to find comfort in the voices on his CB radio or the familiar landmarks of a route he had driven hundreds of times before, Marcus completed his delivery in Salt Lake City and immediately drove home to Sacramento, violating his normal schedule and turning down lucrative return hauls that would have kept him on the road for additional days. He told his wife about the experience, but minimized the terror he had felt, describing it as merely an unsettling encounter with a strange vehicle, rather than a genuinely traumatic stalking that had lasted for hours and challenged everything he understood about reality. She listened with concern, but seemed to think he was just exhausted from too many consecutive night drives. For 3 weeks, Marcus avoided long-haul routes entirely, taking local delivery jobs that kept him within 50 miles of home and allowed him to return every single night before sunset. His income dropped by more than half almost immediately, but he could not bring himself to return to the lonely highways where the shadow truck had hunted him with such deliberate and malicious intent. Other drivers continued reporting encounters with the phantom vehicle on the CB channels he monitored obsessively from his living room, creating a growing mythology around the I-80 corridor and the entity that stalked its darkest stretches between cities. Financial necessity finally forced Marcus back onto the long-haul routes after 22 days of local work. His family depended on his income, and the bills were piling up faster than his reduced paychecks could cover them. His wife had been patient and understanding, but the stress was beginning to show in their conversations about money and their daughter's upcoming expenses for school and activities. He accepted a night run from Sacramento to Denver, telling himself that he would take a southern route through different states, avoiding Nevada entirely and the stretch of highway where his nightmare had occurred. But truck routes are determined by efficiency and fuel costs, and his dispatcher insisted that the I-80 corridor was the only viable option for making the delivery deadline. Marcus argued, even considered refusing the load. But he knew that defying dispatch would cost him his job and possibly his entire career in an industry where reputation and reliability meant everything. He accepted the assignment with a sense of doom settling over him like a heavy blanket he could not shake off. He departed Sacramento just after 9 in the evening, 3 hours later than he had planned, which meant he would be driving through the Nevada desert during the darkest hours before dawn, exactly when the shadow truck had appeared before. Marcus kept his CB radio volume turned up high, listening to other drivers and taking comfort in their voices, discussing weather, traffic, and the mundane problems of life on the road. As long as he could hear other human voices, he felt slightly less alone in the darkness, pressing against his windshield. The shadow truck appeared at 2:47 in the morning, exactly 4 minutes after the last voice faded from his CB radio and left him in silence. This time, there was no gradual approach, no distant headlights slowly catching up to his position. One moment, his mirrors showed empty highway stretching behind him into darkness. The next moment, the phantom truck was there, less than 20 yards from his trailer, close enough that he could see the impossible details of its construction in the red glow of his taillights. Marcus's heart nearly stopped. He screamed into his CB radio for help, broadcasting on every channel, but his calls produced only dead silence. The shadow truck matched his speed perfectly as he accelerated to 80, then 90, pushing his rig beyond any safe operating limit. The entity stayed exactly 20 yards behind, no closer, but no farther, as if that distance had some meaning or purpose in whatever hellish rules governed its existence. For 2 hours, the pursuit continued, with Marcus driving at speeds that should have attracted every highway patrol officer in 3 states. The shadow truck never gained ground, but never fell back, maintaining its precise distance with mechanical perfection that made Marcus understand that this was different from the first encounter. The entity was not hunting him gradually anymore. It had been waiting specifically for his return, and now it was demonstrating that escape was impossible. As the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, Marcus saw a massive truck stop complex ahead, the kind that stayed open 24 hours and housed dozens of trucks and hundreds of people at any given time. He aimed for it like a drowning man swimming toward shore, praying that the sunrise and the presence of witnesses would force the shadow truck to retreat as it had before. He barely made it. The shadow truck was now close enough that Marcus could see in his mirrors that it was literally touching his trailer, the impossible space where its front grille should have been pressed against his rear doors. He could feel the contact through his steering wheel, a cold vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. As he pulled into the truck stop parking lot with the first rays of sun breaking over the mountains, the shadow truck vanished instantly, not fading gradually, but simply ceasing to exist between one moment and the next. Marcus stumbled into the truck stop on shaking legs and found other drivers gathered around a television in the restaurant, watching morning news coverage that made his blood freeze. 3 truckers had vanished during the night on western highways, their trucks found abandoned and still running on remote stretches of I-80, I-70, and Route 93. All 3 drivers had been heard on CB radio talking about a phantom truck following them in the hours before they disappeared. Their trucks showed no signs of struggle or accident. The drivers had simply vanished as if they had never existed, leaving behind vehicles still in gear with logbooks that ended mid-sentence. Marcus recognized one of the names. It was the woman who had reported being followed 3 weeks ago. The one hauling produce from California, whose voice had been shaking with fear on the CB radio. She had kept driving despite the warnings, and now she was gone. Marcus understood with perfect clarity that the shadow truck had let him reach safety this morning as a message. Next time, it would not stop at his trailer. Next time, it would take him into whatever darkness existed beyond the highway, where the vanished drivers were still screaming into radios that no one could hear. And Marcus knew with absolute certainty that there would be a next time, because once the shadow truck chose you, it never stopped hunting until dawn could no longer save you. Sarah had been driving Route 66 through New Mexico for 7 years, ever since she left her corporate job in Chicago and bought her first rig with money inherited from her grandmother. At 34 years old, she loved the independence and solitude of long-haul trucking. Even though most people in her life had questioned her decision to leave a stable career for the uncertain life of the road, the western routes suited her temperament perfectly. With their vast, empty spaces and stunning desert landscapes that changed color with every shift of light. It was approaching 2 in the morning on a clear Friday in mid-September when she first saw the woman standing beside the highway. Sarah was hauling furniture from Albuquerque to Flagstaff, following the historic Route 66 through a section of New Mexico that was so desolate it felt like driving across the surface of an alien planet. She had not seen another vehicle for nearly an hour, and the last gas station had been over 50 miles behind her. There were no buildings, no road signs, no lights of any kind visible in any direction, except the distant glow of stars overhead and her own headlights cutting through absolute darkness. The woman appeared in Sarah's headlights without warning, standing perfectly still on the shoulder of the road and wearing a white dress that seemed to glow with its own luminescence against the black desert night. She was not waving or making any gesture for help, just standing there with her arms at her sides and her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her face was turned toward the approaching truck, with an expression Sarah could not quite read from a distance, something between hope and resignation. Every instinct and every rule of company policy told Sarah to keep driving. Picking up hitchhikers was strictly forbidden, and stopping on remote highways in the middle of the night was dangerous for countless reasons that had been drilled into her during training. But something about the woman's absolute stillness and isolation in the middle of nowhere made Sarah's foot move to the brake pedal almost involuntarily. No buildings for 50 miles in either direction meant no way for this woman to have gotten here on foot, and no signs of a broken-down vehicle anywhere in sight. Sarah brought her rig to a complete stop about 20 feet past where the woman stood, her emergency flashers creating rhythmic pulses of red light that reflected off the white dress in hypnotic patterns. She watched in her side mirror as the woman began walking toward the passenger door with smooth gliding steps that seemed to cover distance too quickly for normal human movement. Sarah reached across and unlocked the door, already beginning to regret her decision, but unable to leave someone stranded in such complete desolation. When the woman climbed into the passenger seat, the temperature in the cab dropped so dramatically that Sarah could see her own breath suddenly visible in the air. The woman's skin was ice cold when her hand briefly touched Sarah's arm during the awkward process of settling into the seat and closing the door. Not just cool from standing outside in the desert night, but genuinely frozen, like touching meat pulled directly from a freezer. Sarah jerked her arm back instinctively, but the woman did not seem to notice or care about her reaction. The hitchhiker was younger than Sarah had initially thought, perhaps in her mid-20s, with delicate features and enormous dark eyes that reflected the dashboard lights with an odd, iridescent quality. She wore no shoes despite standing on the desert highway, and her white dress looked expensive and formal, like something intended for a wedding or special occasion rather than roadside travel. Most disturbing was that the dress showed no signs of dirt or wear, despite the woman supposedly being stranded in the desert. Sarah asked the obvious questions in a voice that sounded shakier than she had intended. Where was the woman going? How had she ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere? Did she need Sarah to call for help or drive her to the nearest town? The woman responded in whispers, so soft that Sarah had to strain to hear them over the sound of the diesel engine idling. She needed to go west, she said. Just west. And she had been waiting for Sarah specifically, though she would not explain how she knew Sarah's name or that she would be driving this route tonight. The woman knew other details she should not have known. She mentioned Sarah's grandmother who had died 3 years ago, the one who left her the inheritance money. She described Sarah's apartment in Amarillo with accuracy that suggested she had been inside it, including the location of personal items and photographs that were not visible to casual visitors. She knew about Sarah's ex-husband and the specific reasons their marriage had ended, details that Sarah had never shared with anyone except her closest friend. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she put the truck back in gear and began driving west, her mind racing to find rational explanations for how this stranger could know so much about her private life. Maybe she was someone from Sarah's past that she did not recognize. Maybe she had access to social media or public records. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate scam or setup. But none of those explanations accounted for the impossible cold radiating from the passenger seat, or the way the woman's voice seemed to come from inside Sarah's own head, rather than from the physical space beside her. As they drove deeper into the New Mexico darkness, with the painted desert stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway, The woman in white finally turned to look directly at Sarah with those strange reflective eyes and whispered something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She knew about the accident that was waiting ahead, the woman said. The one that would happen in exactly 43 miles if Sarah continued on her planned route. The accident that would kill her instantly and leave her truck burning on the roadside just like the last time and the time before that, and all the other times Sarah had died on this highway without remembering. Sarah's mind reeled from the woman's words about dying multiple times on this highway. She wanted to pull over, demand explanations, maybe even force this strange passenger out of her truck. But the woman in white raised one pale finger and pointed ahead to where an unmarked exit was barely visible in the darkness. A crumbling off-ramp that Sarah had never noticed in 7 years of driving this route. "Take that exit," the woman whispered. "It is the only way to avoid what is coming." Sarah checked her GPS mounted on the dashboard, but the device showed no exit at this location. The screen displayed only the straight line of Route 66, continuing westward with no turnoffs for another 37 miles. Yet her headlights clearly illuminated weathered asphalt curving away from the main highway, leading into the desert towards something her mapping system insisted did not exist. Against every rational instinct, Sarah took the exit. The moment her wheels left the main highway, her GPS screen flickered and went completely dark. Her cell phone, charging in the cup holder, displayed a screen full of corrupted symbols before shutting down entirely. The woman in white smiled for the first time, an expression that looked wrong on her delicate face, like a mask that did not quite fit properly. "This road has been closed for 30 years, the woman explained in her whispering voice that seemed to bypass Sarah's ears and speak directly into her thoughts. "Closed since the night I died here. Closed since they found my body in the wreckage of my father's truck, wearing this white dress I had bought for my wedding that never happened. I was 19 years old and so excited about my future. Then the other truck crossed the center line and everything ended in fire and screaming metal. The old highway stretched ahead through the desert, its surface broken and deteriorated in ways that should have made driving impossible. Yet Sarah's truck rolled smoothly over pavement that looked shattered, as if the road existed in two states simultaneously. One version crumbling and abandoned, the other perfectly maintained and solid beneath her tires. The painted lines were faded to near invisibility, but Sarah could somehow see them clearly, glowing with faint phosphorescence in her headlights. Strange things began happening to her truck's instruments almost immediately. The fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full moments before taking the exit, suddenly dropped to empty. The low fuel warning chimed urgently. Sarah's heart raced as she imagined being stranded in the desert with this impossible passenger. Then just as suddenly, the gauge climbed back to full, the needle moving past its normal maximum to point at levels that should not exist on the dial. The speedometer displayed readings that contradicted everything Sarah could sense about her actual velocity. The needle would show 30 miles per hour, while the engine roared and the landscape blurred past at what felt like triple that speed. Then it would jump to 90, while the truck seemed to crawl forward at a walking pace. The tachometer spun in directions that were mechanically impossible, counting backward while the engine clearly accelerated forward. Time itself seemed to behave strangely on this forgotten road. Sarah glanced at her watch and saw the hands spinning forward rapidly, hours passing in what felt like minutes. The digital clock on her dashboard displayed numbers that changed without pattern, jumping from 2:17 to 5:43 to 1:11 in rapid succession. The stars overhead wheeled across the sky in accelerated motion, their positions shifting in ways that suggested hours or even days were passing during each minute of driving. I have been waiting here for someone specific." The woman in white continued, her voice carrying an edge of desperation beneath the whisper. "Not just anyone who drove this highway, but someone connected to what happened to me. Someone whose fate is intertwined with mine in ways that transcend the normal flow of time and death. I died on this road, but I could not move on. Something kept me here, trapped between moments, watching the same stretch of highway loop endlessly while I searched for the one person who could hear my warning. Sarah wanted to ask who the woman was waiting for, what connection they could possibly have. But her voice would not work properly. Words formed in her mind, but would not reach her lips, as if the atmosphere in the cab had become too thick to carry sound. The woman seemed to hear her unspoken questions anyway. "Your grandmother," the woman whispered. "She was driving the other truck that night, the one that crossed the center line and killed me. She was drunk, though the police report never mentioned it because your grandfather knew the sheriff. She lived another 43 years carrying that guilt, and she passed it to you when she died. Not consciously, not deliberately, but guilt like that has weight and substance. It transfers through bloodlines and manifests in strange ways. You have been dying on this highway over and over in different timelines, different versions of reality, paying the debt your grandmother created." The landscape outside Sarah's windows began to shift and change in impossible ways. She saw the same rock formations repeat, then transform into completely different terrain, then shift back again. Dead Joshua trees became living ones, then turned into saguaro cacti that should not exist in New Mexico, then became Joshua trees again. The sky cycled through sunset colors, despite it being the middle of the night, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at directly. In the distance, Sarah began to see other vehicles on the road. Trucks from different eras, their designs spanning decades of automotive history. Some looked like they belonged in the 1940s, others from the present day. They drove parallel to her route, but seemed to exist in slightly different versions of the same highway, visible through a membrane that separated timelines or realities. She recognized her own truck among them in several iterations, with different paint colors and configurations, all being driven by women who looked exactly like her. The woman in white reached across and touched Sarah's arm with fingers that felt like frozen metal. "Ahead," she whispered, "is where I died. Where you have died. Where you will die again if you do not make the choice I offer you. The accident is not random. It is a fixed point, a moment that repeats across infinite variations because the debt must be paid. But I have learned to navigate these loops, and I can show you the exit that leads away from death, if you are willing to accept what it will cost." The woman in white's words hung in the cold air of the cab, like a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel as the impossible highway continued to unspool before her, reality warping and bending around them with each passing moment. She finally found her voice, forcing words through a throat that felt constricted with terror. "What cost?" Sarah managed to ask. The woman turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw that her eyes were not just reflective, but completely black, like pools of liquid darkness that absorbed all light. "You must take someone's place," she whispered. "That is how the loop works. Someone must die at that spot on the highway tonight. It has been written into the fabric of this road since the moment my blood soaked into the asphalt 30 years ago. If you do not die there, someone else must. A willing substitution, a conscious choice to redirect death from one path to another." Sarah felt bile rising in her throat. You want me to kill someone else to save myself? The woman shook her head slowly. Not kill. Choose. There is a truck driver behind you on the main highway. A man who has driven drunk 3 times this month and will do it again next week, and eventually kill a family of 4. There is a woman ahead of you who will fall asleep at the wheel in 2 hours and cross into oncoming traffic, killing herself and 2 others. There are always choices on these roads. Death is coming regardless. I am offering you the chance to direct it towards someone who has already earned it, rather than accepting your own undeserved fate. Through her windows, Sarah could now see the accident site approaching in the distance. Multiple timelines showed simultaneously, overlapping images of carnage that had happened, was happening, would happen. She saw her own truck crushed and burning, saw herself trapped behind the wheel, screaming as flames consumed the cab, saw emergency responders arriving hours too late to find anything but charred remains. The vision was so vivid and real that she could smell the smoke and feel the heat on her skin. 5 miles, the woman whispered. Then it happens. Unless you take the exit, I show you. An off-ramp appeared ahead, shimmering into existence like a mirage solidifying into reality. It led away from the doomed section of highway, curving back toward what Sarah recognized as the original Route 66. The GPS screen, which had been dead since they took the ghost road, suddenly flickered back to life and showed the exit clearly, as if it had always been there. But Sarah saw something else too. In her side mirror, she could see another truck approaching on the main highway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A real truck, not a ghost or timeline echo. Someone who would arrive at the accident site at exactly the moment Sarah would have if she continued straight. Someone who would die instead of her if she took the exit. I cannot do this, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I cannot choose for someone else to die. The woman's expression shifted into something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. Then you choose to die yourself. Again. For the 47th time across 47 different versions of this night. Your grandmother's guilt is strong, but your own righteousness is stronger. It keeps you trapped here, dying endlessly because you refuse to make the choice that would free you. The exit was approaching rapidly. Sarah had seconds to decide. Her foot hovered over the brake pedal, her mind screaming contradictory commands. Every moral fiber insisted she could not condemn another person to death. But the animal part of her brain, the survival instinct that had kept humans alive through millennia of danger, was shrieking at her to take the exit and live. At the last possible moment, Sarah jerked the wheel to the right and took the exit. The truck's tires squealed as she made the sharp turn at too high a speed. She felt the trailer swing wide behind her, threatening to jackknife. But somehow the vehicle held its trajectory and carried her away from the doomed stretch of highway. The moment she committed to the turn, the woman in white vanished. Not fading gradually, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The temperature in the cab returned to normal so suddenly that Sarah gasped. Her GPS showed her location on Route 66 approaching Gallup, exactly where she should have been, according to her schedule. Her fuel gauge read 3/4 full. Her speedometer showed 68 miles per hour. Everything appeared completely normal except for the passenger seat, where the fabric still showed the impression of someone sitting there, and frost crystals decorated the armrest in delicate patterns. Sarah drove to the next truck stop and collapsed in the parking lot, shaking uncontrollably. She stayed there until sunrise, drinking coffee that tasted like ashes and trying to convince herself she had hallucinated the entire encounter. Then she checked her phone and saw the news alerts that made her blood freeze. Massive pileup on Route 66 near the New Mexico-Arizona border. 5 vehicles involved. 3 fatalities confirmed, including a male truck driver who witnesses said appeared to swerve suddenly into oncoming traffic for no apparent reason. The accident occurred at exactly 2:47 in the morning, precisely when Sarah would have been at that location if she had not taken the exit. Over the following days, Sarah began hearing stories from other truckers on the CB channels. A woman in a white dress appearing on desert highways at night. Some drivers picked her up and followed her directions, taking mysterious exits that saved them from accidents they learned about later. Others refused to stop for her or ignored her warnings. Those drivers were dead now, their names appearing in accident reports from highways across the Southwest. Sarah realized with creeping horror that the woman had not asked her to choose who would die. That choice had already been made by forces beyond her understanding. The woman had only asked whether Sarah wanted to live, and Sarah had answered by taking the exit. The drunk driver who died in her place would have killed others eventually. That was what Sarah told herself in the sleepless nights that followed. That was the rationalization that allowed her to keep driving. But late at night, when Sarah was alone on dark highways, with only her headlights cutting through the void, she sometimes caught glimpses of the woman in white standing beside distant roads, watching, waiting for the next driver who would face the choice. And Sarah understood with absolute certainty that she had not escaped the loop at all. She had simply accepted a different role in it. Now she was part of the pattern, one of the saved ones who carried the weight of knowing someone else died so she could live. The woman in white had not freed her from her grandmother's guilt. She had multiplied it, adding Sarah's own impossible choice to the burden passed down through blood and time. And that weight would follow her down every dark highway for the rest of her life, growing heavier with each mile until the road finally claimed her anyway in some future moment when no ghostly hitchhiker would appear to offer salvation. James had been hauling freight across Montana for 16 years, ever since his discharge from the Marines at 22 years old. The I-90 corridor between Billings and Missoula was his favorite route. A straight shot through Big Sky country with mountain views that never got old, no matter how many times he made the trip. At 38 years old, with a wife and twin sons back home in Bozeman, he took pride in his reliability and his ability to handle any road conditions the Montana weather could throw at him. It was mid-afternoon on a Wednesday in late March, when everything stopped working simultaneously. James was hauling machinery parts from Billings toward Butte, making excellent time on clear roads with light traffic. The spring weather was perfect, temperature in the mid-50s with unlimited visibility under a bright afternoon sun. He had been listening to classic rock on his CB radio while monitoring the trucker channels for traffic updates and road conditions ahead. At exactly 2:37 in the afternoon, according to the digital clock on his dashboard, every electronic device in his truck died at the same instant. The CB radio cut to silence mid-song, not fading or crackling with static, but simply stopping as if someone had flipped a master power switch. His cell phone, mounted on the dashboard and showing full signal strength a moment before, went completely dark. The screen did not dim or show a low battery warning. It just turned black like a television being unplugged. His GPS unit died the same way, the detailed map display vanishing to leave a blank screen that reflected his confused expression back at him. James tapped the devices, checked connections, tried restarting each one using their power buttons. Nothing responded. The truck's engine continued running normally, and the basic mechanical instruments like his speedometer and fuel gauge still functioned. But everything that connected him to the outside world had ceased to exist. Then he noticed the dashboard readings that made his stomach clench with the first real stab of fear. The outside temperature display, which had shown 53 degrees moments before, now read 117. The compass that normally showed his direction of travel was spinning slowly in continuous circles, unable to lock onto any heading. The odometer appeared frozen, showing the exact same mileage despite his truck clearly continuing to move forward at 65 miles per hour. James looked out his windows at the landscape rolling past and saw nothing unusual at first glance. The highway stretched ahead through open rangeland with distant mountains visible on the horizon. The pavement was in good condition, the painted lines crisp and clear. But as he continued driving, trying to make sense of his malfunctioning equipment, he began to notice impossible details that made his skin crawl. The mile markers were wrong. He passed a green sign reading mile 242 and began counting in his head, timing his speed to calculate when the next marker should appear. When it came into view, it also read mile 242. Same number, identical sign. James thought perhaps he had miscounted or misread the first marker, but then the third sign also displayed mile 242 in the same position on the right shoulder. He was passing the same mile marker over and over, despite driving forward at consistent speed on a straight highway. The odometer remained frozen at 53,812 miles. James had driven this route hundreds of times and knew there should be a rest area appearing within the next few miles. But the landscape showed no signs of human development in any direction. The complete absence of other vehicles became noticeable around the fourth or fifth identical mile marker. I-90 was a major trucking route and commercial corridor, always busy with semis, cars, and tourist traffic, even during slower seasons. James should have seen dozens of vehicles by now, overtaking slower traffic or being passed by faster cars. But the highway ahead and behind showed no movement except his own truck, no distant vehicles visible even with miles of clear visibility in both directions. He tried his CB radio again, cycling through every channel and calling out for anyone who might hear his transmission. The speakers remained completely silent, not even producing the background static that indicated the device was powered on. His cell phone would not respond to any button presses, the screen staying black no matter what he tried. He was completely cut off from communication with the outside world, alone on a highway that should have been crowded but stretched empty in both directions. The sun's position troubled him most of all. When his electronics had died, the afternoon sun had been in the western sky at an angle consistent with mid-afternoon in late March. But as James continued driving, passing the same mile marker again and again, the sun's position never changed. It remained frozen at approximately 45 degrees above the horizon, casting shadows at the exact same angle no matter how much time passed, according to his internal sense of duration. James tried to maintain calm and think rationally about his situation. Electronics failed sometimes. GPS satellites could lose signal in certain conditions. But the combination of failures happening simultaneously, along with the repeating mile markers and frozen sun position, suggested something beyond normal mechanical problems. He was experiencing something impossible, caught in a section of highway where the normal rules of time and space had stopped functioning correctly. After passing what he estimated was the 20th iteration of mile 242, James made a decision to pull over and assess his situation more carefully. But when he moved his foot to the brake pedal and began slowing down, he discovered something that transformed his confusion into genuine terror. The truck would not stop. The brakes felt normal under his foot, the pedal depressed properly, but his speed remained constant at 65 miles per hour regardless of how hard he pressed. He tried shifting gears, pumping the brakes, even pulling the emergency brake handle. Nothing changed his forward momentum through this impossible loop of repeating highway. James had been driving for what felt like an hour when he first noticed the abandoned gas station. It appeared on the right side of the highway. a dilapidated structure with rusted pumps and a collapsed canopy that looked like it had been out of business for decades. The windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, and the faded sign was too deteriorated to read whatever brand it had once advertised. He noted it mentally as a landmark, something to help him maintain his sense of orientation in this nightmare loop. 20 minutes later, by his internal estimation, since his clock had frozen at 2:37, he passed the same gas station again. Same rusted pumps, same collapsed canopy, same boarded windows on the right side of the highway. James felt his heart rate accelerate. He was driving in a straight line at constant speed on what should have been a 100-mile stretch of interstate. Seeing the same landmark twice was impossible, unless he was somehow circling back without realizing it. But the highway ahead showed no curves, no exits, no way he could have turned around without knowing it. The road stretched perfectly straight to the horizon in both directions. Yet somehow, he was looping back to the same point over and over. He began counting carefully, timing his speed and watching for the gas station to reappear. 23 minutes after the second sighting, it appeared again, identical in every detail, down to the same piece of tumbleweeds caught against the fence surrounding the property. His fuel gauge had not moved since entering this dead zone. It still showed 3/4 full, exactly where it had been when his electronics died. James should have burned through at least 1/8 of a tank by now, probably more given the amount of time he had been driving. But the needle remained frozen at the same position, suggesting either his truck was no longer consuming fuel or the normal rules of physics had stopped applying to his vehicle. The temperature reading on his dashboard had climbed to 230 degrees, according to the malfunctioning display. That temperature should have been fatal, should have turned the interior of his cab into an oven that would kill him within minutes. But James felt nothing unusual. The air temperature seemed perfectly comfortable, maybe slightly cool if anything. He touched the window glass with his palm and found it room temperature, not the burning surface it should have been if the outside air was truly that hot. During the fourth loop past the gas station, James spotted something that made him sit up straighter in his seat. In the far distance ahead, perhaps 2 or 3 miles away, he could see the silhouette of another semi-truck on the highway. The first sign of another vehicle since entering this impossible stretch of road. Hope surged through him. If he could catch up to that truck, compare notes with another driver, maybe they could figure out together what was happening and how to escape it. James pushed his accelerator down further, trying to increase his speed and close the distance. But the speedometer remained locked at 65 miles per hour, and the distant truck never got any closer. It stayed perpetually on the horizon, always the same distance away, no matter how long he drove toward it. After passing the gas station again, he noticed the distant truck was still ahead of him in exactly the same position, as if both vehicles were locked on invisible tracks that prevented them from ever making contact. The landscape began changing in subtle ways with each repetition of the loop. The first time he passed the gas station, the mountains in the distance had been their normal blue-gray color. The second time, they looked slightly different. The peaks arranged in configurations that did not quite match his memory. By the 5th or 6th loop, the mountains had taken on an orange tint that reminded him of photographs from Mars, and their shapes had become more jagged and angular than any natural erosion could create. The abandoned gas station itself was transforming. Each time James passed it, small details were different. Windows that had been boarded up on one loop were broken and gaping on the next. The collapsed canopy straightened slightly, then collapsed further, then twisted into a shape that looked almost organic, like bones bent by impossible force. The fence surrounding the property changed from chain link to wooden posts to something that looked like it was made from dark metal twisted into thorny patterns. The repeating mile marker reading 242 began displaying different numbers with each loop, but none of them made sequential sense. It would read 242, then 817, then 63, then negative 1990, then symbols that were not numbers at all, but strange geometric shapes that hurt James's eyes to look at directly. The highway itself remained perfectly straight and apparently unchanged, but the painted lines started shifting colors from yellow to green to deep purple to shades that James did not have names for. James saw more trucks in the distance now, dozens of them scattered across the landscape at varying distances from the highway. But they were all frozen in place, like toys positioned by a giant child, some tilted at impossible angles or partially sunk into the ground. A few appeared to be driving vertically up the sides of the distorted mountains. Others seemed to be duplicates of each other, identical trucks in parallel positions, suggesting multiple versions of the same vehicle existing simultaneously. The sun remained locked in its position above the horizon, but its color was changing. The normal yellow-white light was taking on an amber quality, then red, then a sickly green that made the landscape look poisonous and alien. The shadows it cast no longer matched the light source position, stretching in directions that made no geometric sense and sometimes moving independently of the objects creating them. During what James estimated was the 12th loop, his fuel gauge finally moved, but instead of dropping as it consumed fuel, it began climbing higher. The needle moved past full into the red zone beyond the normal maximum, then kept going, bending backward on itself in a curve that should have been mechanically impossible. The temperature reading hit 411 degrees, then jumped to -73, then displayed symbols that looked like letters from alphabets James did not recognize. He tried screaming, hoping someone might hear even though his radio was dead, and he had seen no living person since entering this zone. His voice sounded wrong in the cab, the acoustics distorted so that his words seemed to echo back at him from directions that had no physical source. The steering wheel felt strange under his hands, the texture shifting between smooth plastic and rough metal, and something organic that made his skin crawl. The abandoned gas station appeared again, but this time it was not abandoned. Lights blazed from inside the building through windows that were no longer boarded. The pumps gleamed as if newly installed. A figure stood beside one of the pumps, wearing what looked like an attendant's uniform from the 1950s. As James's truck approached, unable to slow or stop, the figure turned to watch him pass. Its face was a smooth, blank surface with no features, just empty skin where eyes and mouth should have been. The faceless attendant was still visible in James's side mirror when he heard the voice crackling through his CB radio. The sound startled him so badly he jerked the wheel, though the truck's course did not change despite his movement. The radio had been dead for hours, or what felt like hours, producing nothing but silence since he entered this impossible loop. The voice was male, rough with exhaustion and desperation. "Is anyone out there? Can anyone hear me? I have been driving for 3 days. 3 days on the same stretch of highway. My family thinks I am dead. Please, if someone can hear this, respond." James grabbed his CB microphone with shaking hands. "I hear you. I am here. Where are you?" There was a pause. Then the voice came back stronger, infused with something between hope and hysteria. "You are in the loop too. How long have you been here?" "I do not know," James admitted. "Maybe 6 hours. It feels like longer. I keep passing the same gas station over and over." 6 hours? The other voice laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "I have made the loop 73 times. I have been counting. Each cycle takes approximately 24 minutes. That is 3 days. 3 days driving the same road, seeing the same landmarks change and twist. My name is David. I drive for Western Transport out of Seattle. And I think I might know how to get out. James felt hope flaring in his chest for the first time since this nightmare began. How? What did you find? There is a pattern, David explained. Every loop, for just a few seconds, a dirt road appears on the left side. It is only visible for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and it appears at a different point in each loop. But it is always there somewhere. I have been too afraid to take it, worried it might make things worse. But things cannot get worse than this. I would rather risk the unknown than drive this loop forever. I have not seen any dirt road, James said, scanning the landscape ahead and behind through his mirrors. You will, David promised. Start watching on the left side. Next loop, look for it. When you see it, we take it together. 2 trucks have a better chance than 1. James passed the transforming gas station again, this time seeing the faceless attendant now standing in the middle of the highway behind him, growing smaller in his mirror, but never disappearing completely. He focused his attention on the left side of the road, watching for any break in the fence line or opening in the landscape that might indicate a turnoff. During the next loop, he spotted it. A narrow dirt road that appeared between one heartbeat and the next, cutting through the fence and leading off into the distorted landscape. It existed for perhaps 6 seconds before vanishing as completely as if it had never been there. James keyed his microphone. I saw it, about 2 miles past the gas station. I saw it too, David confirmed. Different location than my last sighting. Next time one of us spots it, we both turn immediately. Do not hesitate. Do not second guess. Just turn. They passed 3 more loops before James saw the dirt road appear again, this time on his side of the highway much closer to the gas station. Now, he shouted into his CB, yanking his steering wheel to the left. For the first time since entering the dead zone, his truck responded to his control. The vehicle lurched left onto the dirt road, tires kicking up dust that glowed with the same wrong-colored light as the poisonous sun. In his mirror, James saw another semi taking the same turn, close enough behind him that he could see the driver's face through the windshield. A man who looked like he had aged years in days, with wild eyes and a beard that seemed too long for 3 days of growth. The dirt road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for 1 truck, let alone 2. It wound through landscape that became increasingly alien and threatening as they drove deeper into it. The sky above shifted through colors that should not exist, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with rhythmic movement, like breathing. But they were moving forward, no longer trapped in the loop, and that gave James strength to keep driving. After what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, the dirt road merged with what looked like a normal highway. James's GPS suddenly blazed to life, showing his location on I-90 approximately 15 miles past where he had entered the dead zone. The digital clock read 8:43 in the evening. 6 hours had passed according to the device, though his sense of experienced time felt both longer and shorter simultaneously. His CB radio crackled. We made it, David's voice said. We actually made it out. James pulled onto the shoulder of what appeared to be the real highway, his entire body shaking with relief and delayed terror. He could see the other truck pulling over ahead of him, emergency flashers coming on. James activated his own flashers and climbed down from his cab on legs that barely supported his weight. He walked toward the other truck, intending to meet David face to face, to confirm that another human being had shared his nightmare and escaped with him. But as he approached the vehicle with its door hanging open and lights still on, he found the cab completely empty. No driver, no signs anyone had been there. The seat was covered in dust that looked undisturbed for months. James ran back to his own truck and checked his logbook, the paper record every trucker was required to maintain. His last entry was 3 days ago. The pages covering the time in the dead zone were filled with his own handwriting, but the words made no sense. They were the same phrases repeated thousands of times in increasingly erratic script. Mile 242, mile 242, mile 242, cannot stop, cannot stop, cannot stop the sun, never moves, never moves, never moves. His cell phone showed 73 missed calls from his wife. 73. One for each loop David had counted during his 3 days trapped in the zone. The voicemails progressed from concern to frantic to resigned grief. The last one was her telling their sons that Daddy was not coming home, that he had disappeared like the other drivers who had vanished on this stretch of highways over the years. James called her immediately, and she answered sobbing. But even as he tried to explain what had happened, he could not make the story sound believable, even to himself. He had lost 3 days in what felt like hours. He had talked to another driver who had never existed. He had escaped a loop in reality by taking a road that probably was not real either. That night, parked at a truck stop surrounded by other drivers and bright lights, James researched the stretch of highway where he had been trapped. He found reports going back decades, drivers who had disappeared without explanation on that exact section of I-90. Trucks found abandoned with engines still running and logbooks filled with nonsensical repetition. Families who never got answers about what happened to their loved ones. The worst part was the pattern he discovered in the dates of disappearances. They occurred in 73-day cycles, exactly 73 days between each incident. And according to his calculation, he had escaped on day 73, which meant the dead zone was resetting. Getting ready for its next victim, James never drove through Montana again. He quit long-haul trucking entirely and took a local delivery job that kept him within 50 miles of home. But sometimes late at night, his CB radio would activate by itself, even though it was turned off and unplugged. And he would hear David's voice asking if anyone could hear him, reporting that he had been driving for 3 days, begging someone to respond. James learned to ignore it, learned to live with the knowledge that he had not escaped alone. He had left someone behind in the loop, or perhaps brought something back with him. And the voice on his radio was either a ghost crying out from an impossible prison, or a warning that the dead zone had not finished with him yet. Daniel had been driving the I-40 corridor through the Texas Panhandle for 9 years, hauling electronics and computer components from Oklahoma City to Albuquerque twice a week with the reliability that had earned him bonuses every quarter. At 41 years old, he knew every way station, every speed trap, every patch of rough road along the route. He prided himself on following regulations to the letter, maintaining his logbook with meticulous accuracy, and never giving inspectors any reason to delay his deliveries. The way station appeared in his headlights just past midnight on a Thursday in early November. Daniel did not remember this particular facility from previous runs, but the Texas Department of Transportation had been upgrading infrastructure along this corridor for years. New stations appeared regularly to handle the increasing commercial traffic moving between the east and west coasts. The sign read, "All commercial vehicles must enter," in reflective letters that glowed bright white in his headlights. The facility looked abandoned as Daniel pulled off the highway onto the access road. No other trucks were visible in the parking area. The office windows were dark and appeared empty. The entire complex had an air of neglect that seemed wrong for a station that should have been actively processing traffic. Daniel considered driving past, but the regulation sign left no ambiguity. Failure to stop at a mandatory way station could result in fines, points on his license, and potential loss of his commercial driving privileges. As his truck rolled onto the scale platform, The lights activated automatically. Bright sodium vapor lamps blazed to life in sequence, illuminating the entire facility with harsh yellow-white light that erased all shadows and created a sterile environment that felt more like an operating room than a highway checkpoint. The scale beneath his wheels hummed with power, its electronic display cycling through numbers too quickly for Daniel to read. A figure emerged from the inspection office, moving into the light with steps that were too measured and precise to be natural human locomotion. The man wore an inspector's uniform that looked like it came from the 1950s or 60s, with a style and cut that modern highway patrol had not used in decades. The shirt was crisp and perfectly pressed, the badges and insignia polished to mirror brightness. Everything about the uniform was correct in detail, but wrong in era, like a costume assembled by someone who had studied historical photographs, but never seen the real thing. Daniel rolled down his window as the inspector approached, trying to maintain the professional courtesy that usually made inspections proceed smoothly. "Evening, officer. Just making my regular run to Albuquerque." The inspector stopped beside Daniel's door and looked up at him. His face was the first thing that triggered Daniel's instinctive alarm response. The features were too sharp, too angular, with edges and planes that human bone structure did not quite produce. His eyes were positioned correctly, but seemed to focus too intently, without the normal small movements of human vision. When he smiled, his teeth were perfectly white and perfectly even, like a denture advertisement rather than real human dentistry. "Step down from the vehicle," the inspector said, in a voice that had the right words and proper Texas accent, but somehow felt artificial, as if produced by a machine programmed to simulate human speech patterns. "We need to conduct a full inspection of your cargo and vehicle systems." Daniel's manifest was in order. His truck had passed inspection 2 weeks ago, and his logbook showed he was well within his legal driving hours. There should have been no reason for a detailed inspection at midnight on an empty way station. But the inspector's expression left no room for negotiation or discussion. Daniel climbed down from his cab, his boots hitting the concrete with sounds that echoed oddly in the harsh, artificial light. The inspector circled Daniel's truck slowly, examining every detail with attention that went beyond normal inspection procedures. He ran his fingers along seams and joints that should not have interested someone checking for safety violations. He peered under the chassis from angles that served no regulatory purpose. His movements remained too precise, too deliberate, like someone performing memorized choreography rather than conducting a familiar task. "Open the trailer," the inspector commanded, standing at the rear doors with one hand resting on his equipment belt. "I need to verify your cargo matches the manifest." Daniel unlocked and opened the rear doors, revealing stacked pallets of boxed electronics secured with proper restraints and load bars. Everything was exactly as his paperwork indicated. Loaded professionally at the distribution center in Oklahoma City that morning. The inspector climbed into the trailer using the rear bumper, his movements showing impossible balance and coordination that allowed him to navigate the narrow spaces between pallets without any apparent effort. After several minutes of searching through the cargo, the inspector's voice called out from deep inside the trailer. "Your manifest indicates electronics. This cargo does not match your documentation." Daniel felt confusion mixing with growing unease. "That is impossible. I watched them load it myself this morning. Everything is sealed and documented." The inspector emerged from the trailer carrying one of the boxes, which he set on the ground and opened with a knife produced from his belt. Inside were not electronics, but old personal belongings. Clothing from decades past, yellowed photographs of people Daniel did not recognize, letters written in faded ink. Items that looked like they had been packed away and forgotten for generations. "This is not my cargo." Daniel insisted, his voice rising with anxiety. "Someone switched the load. This is not what I picked up." The inspector opened more boxes, revealing similar contents in each one. Personal effects, family heirlooms, memorabilia from lives lived and ended decades ago. Some boxes contained items that looked even older, artifacts that might have belonged in museums rather than commercial trucks. As Daniel watched in growing horror, the inspector pulled out a logbook from one box, opened it, and read aloud entries that Daniel recognized as his own handwriting describing cargo he had no memory of accepting. Daniel stared at the logbook in the inspector's hands, reading his own handwriting describing cargo he had never seen before. The entries were detailed and specific, listing furniture, personal effects, and household items loaded at an address in Oklahoma City that was not the distribution center where he remembered starting his day. The dates matched today's date, the times were sequential and logical, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakably his own. "This is not possible," Daniel said, his voice sounding weak even to his own ears. "I loaded electronics this morning. Computer components. I watched them scan every box." The inspector's two sharp features arranged themselves into an expression that might have been skepticism on a normal human face, but looked predatory and threatening on his angular countenance. "You signed the bill of lading," he said, holding up a document that Daniel had never seen before. "Your signature is here, acknowledging receipt of one full load of personal property and estate items for transport to a storage facility in Albuquerque." Daniel took the paper with shaking hands and examined it under the harsh lights. The signature was his, written with the same pen pressure and letter formation he had used for years. But he had no memory of signing this document or accepting any cargo except the electronics shipment from his regular client. The bill of lading listed dozens of items in categories that made his skin crawl. Bedroom furniture circa 1945. Children's toys and clothing dated 1962. Wedding photographs and personal correspondence spanning 1978 to 2003. The inspector began removing more items from the trailer, setting them in organized rows on the concrete pad of the weigh station. A wooden rocking chair that looked handmade, its finish worn from decades of use. A trunk filled with military uniforms from the Second World War. Boxes of vinyl records from the 1970s. A wedding dress wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. Each item appeared to come from different eras, different families, different lives that had been lived and ended. "Where did this come from?" Daniel demanded, fighting to keep panic out of his voice. "Who loaded this? I need to call my dispatcher." He reached for his cell phone but found it unresponsive, the screen dark despite being fully charged when he pulled into the weigh station. The inspector watched him with those two focused eyes that never seemed to blink or shift their gaze. "Your dispatcher has no record of you," he said calmly. "I checked while you were examining the cargo. According to their system, you called in sick this morning and did not accept any loads today." "That is insane," Daniel shouted. "I have been driving for 9 hours. I stopped for fuel in Amarillo. I have receipts." But when he checked his wallet for the fuel receipt he knew he had gotten just 2 hours earlier, he found instead receipts from a completely different route. Fuel purchases in towns he had not visited, dated over the past 3 days rather than the single day he remembered. Restaurant receipts for meals he had not eaten. Hotel charges for nights he had not spent away from home. His credit card statement showed a pattern of activity that described a different journey entirely. The inspector pulled out a piece of furniture that made Daniel's heart stop. It was a small wooden desk with hand-carved details he recognized instantly because it had belonged to his grandfather. The desk had been destroyed in a house fire 7 years ago when his grandfather's home burned down. Daniel had attended the funeral and the estate sale where they sold off the few items that had survived. This desk had not survived. He had seen its charred remains himself. "How do you have this?" Daniel whispered, approaching the desk and running his fingers over wood that should not exist. "This burned. I saw it burn." The inspector consulted his clipboard with movements that were too smooth and controlled. "According to your cargo manifest, you picked this up from an estate liquidation in Oklahoma City this morning. The seller's name is listed as Thomas Brennan, your grandfather. He signed the transfer of ownership to you personally." "My grandfather has been dead for 7 years," Daniel said numbly. The inspector tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly wrong, too far to be comfortable, but not quite far enough to be impossible. "Has he?" "The clipboard shows his signature dated today. His address is listed as the home where he lived before the fire." "Before he died? Are you certain about your timeline?" Daniel's logbook, which the inspector still held, showed entries going back not just days but weeks. His own handwriting described picking up loads from people he knew were dead, delivering items to addresses that no longer existed, making trips to towns that had been abandoned or demolished years ago. The entries were detailed and mundane, describing weather conditions and traffic patterns and truck stop meals, all written in his distinctive style. He grabbed the logbook and flipped through the pages, seeing months of entries he had not written, but which were undeniably in his hand. The most recent entry, from just hours before he pulled into this way station, described completing a delivery to his grandfather's old address, the address that had been vacant land since the fire. The entry noted that his grandfather had met him personally, helped unload furniture, and paid in cash for the delivery service. The inspector began examining Daniel's truck with increasing aggression, finding violations that should not have existed. Brake systems that Daniel knew were perfect showed wear beyond legal limits. Tires that had been replaced last month appeared bald and dangerous. Lights that functioned normally were somehow burned out when the inspector checked them. Each discovery was documented with photographs and detailed notes, building a case that Daniel's truck was unsafe and his cargo was undocumented and illegal. "You are in serious violation of federal transportation regulations," the inspector announced. "Falsified logbook entries, undocumented cargo, unsafe vehicle operation. I am placing you and your vehicle out of service until a complete investigation can be conducted." Daniel tried to protest, to argue, to make sense of what was happening. But more items continued to emerge from his trailer. A child's bicycle that had belonged to his daughter, who was now 23 years old. His ex-wife's wedding dress from a marriage that had ended in divorce 15 years ago. His mother's china set that had been sold when she moved into assisted living. Every item was something from his past. Things that had been lost or destroyed or given away, now somehow loaded into his truck and documented in his own handwriting as cargo he had willingly accepted. The inspector opened one final box and removed something that made Daniel's world tilt on its axis. It was a photograph of Daniel himself, standing beside this exact truck at this exact way station. But the photograph was old. The colors faded in ways that suggested decades of aging. And in the background, barely visible in the poor light of the image, was the inspector, wearing the same outdated uniform, holding the same clipboard, watching with the same sharp-featured face that was watching Daniel right now. Daniel held the aged photograph with trembling hands, staring at his own face looking back from decades ago. The inspector stood motionless, watching him with those predatory eyes that never blinked. The silence stretched between them until Daniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like distant thunder. "You have been here before," the inspector finally said, his artificial voice somehow gentler than before. Many times, actually. This is your 43rd visit to this particular way station. Each time you arrive, convinced it is your first time. Each time you examine the cargo with the same confusion and denial. Each time I explain, and each time you refuse to understand. What are you talking about? Daniel demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. Some part of him, buried deep beneath layers of denial, was beginning to understand things he did not want to know. The inspector gestured at the way station around them, at the harsh lights illuminating the impossible cargo scattered across the concrete. This facility does not exist on your maps or in your memories of this route because it exists between places. A collection point for loads that fell through cracks in reality. Cargo that should have reached destinations but instead ended up in liminal spaces where the rules of time and causality do not function normally. He walked to Daniel's truck and placed one hand on the hood, his touch leaving no warmth or impression on the metal. Your truck and cargo do not match because you are not where you think you are. You have been dead for 2 days, Daniel. Killed in an accident on this highway that you do not remember because death trauma has a way of erasing the final moments. The collision happened approximately 80 miles east of here, just before dawn on Tuesday morning. Your truck crossed the center line. The investigation report will conclude you fell asleep at the wheel. No, Daniel said automatically, but the word felt hollow. I am here. I am alive. I am driving. The inspector pulled out his clipboard and showed Daniel a page he had not seen before. It was a highway patrol incident report, complete with photographs. Daniel saw his truck wrapped around a concrete barrier, the cab crushed and torn open. He saw emergency responders working around the wreckage. He saw a body bag being loaded into an ambulance. The report listed his name, his age, his home address. Time of death, 5:27 in the morning, 2 days ago. You have 2 choices, the inspector explained, his sharp features showing something that might have been compassion in a human face. You can accept what happened and allow yourself to move on to whatever comes after this. Or you can return to the highway and continue driving, trapped in the loop of your final route, delivering impossible cargo to destinations that do not exist, stopping at this way station again and again for eternity. Many drivers choose the second option. They cannot let go of the road. The inspector gestured toward the far edge of the way station, where the light faded into darkness. Daniel had not noticed them before, but now he could see other trucks parked in the shadows. Dozens of them, maybe. Hundreds, each with their lights off and their engines silent. Some looked modern, others were ancient models that should have been in museums. All were perfectly maintained, but somehow empty, abandoned by drivers who had made their choice. Watch, the inspector said. A figure emerged from the darkness and climbed into one of the trucks. Daniel recognized the jerky, uncertain movements of someone in denial. Someone going through familiar motions because routine was easier than accepting truth. The truck's lights came on, the engine started, and the vehicle pulled away from the way station back onto a highway that Daniel could now see was not quite real. It shimmered and wavered like a mirage, connecting to roads that existed in memory rather than physical space. That driver has been leaving and returning for 17 years, the inspector said. He makes the same route over and over, stopping at truck stops that closed decades ago, delivering cargo to addresses that were demolished or never existed. Every few weeks he comes back here. We have the same conversation, and he chooses to leave again. Because accepting death is harder than driving forever. Daniel looked at the cargo spread across the concrete, understanding finally what he was seeing. These were not random items from strangers' lives. They were pieces of his own life, collected and cataloged. The desk was not just similar to his grandfather's, it was the exact desk, pulled from the moment before the fire consumed it. The bicycle was his daughter's, taken from the day she learned to ride before he had to sell it. Every item represented something he had lost, given away, or left behind on his journey through life. The inspector opened Daniel's logbook to a page near the end and showed him an entry he had not wanted to read. It described the final moments before the accident, the fatigue after driving too many hours, the way his eyes had closed just for a second, the sickening realization that he had drifted across the center line, the impact. And then, in handwriting that became increasingly erratic and desperate, repeated denials that it had happened, insistence that he was fine, still driving, still on schedule. "Your family held your funeral yesterday," the inspector said, showing Daniel a newspaper obituary with his photograph. "Your daughter spoke at the service. Your ex-wife attended despite your difficult divorce. Your dispatcher sent flowers. They have said their goodbyes. The only person who has not let go is you." Daniel felt something cracking inside him, a dam breaking under pressure it could no longer contain. Memories flooded back. The drowsiness he had been fighting for the past hour of driving, the way his head had nodded forward, the terrible moment of waking up as his truck veered across the highway, the screaming of metal and the sensation of his body being crushed by forces beyond human endurance, and then the confused awakening, the sense that he was still driving, still making his route, denying the accident that had just ended his life. "If I go back," Daniel whispered, looking at the highway shimmering in the darkness, "what happens?" The inspector followed his gaze. "You drive forever. You stop at way stations that do not exist. You deliver cargo to the dead. You see your family sometimes, watch them grieve and eventually heal and move on with their lives, while you remain trapped in the eternal loop of your final route. Some drivers find comfort in the familiar routine. Others go mad from the isolation. But none of them ever truly rest." Daniel turned to look at the other trucks, really seeing them now. He could sense the drivers inside them, some sleeping in their cabs, others sitting awake and staring at nothing. They were aware enough to know something was wrong, but not brave enough to confront the truth. Trapped between death and acceptance, driving roads that led nowhere, making deliveries that meant nothing. "And if I accept it?" Daniel asked. "What then?" The inspector's sharp features softened slightly. "Then you move on. To what, I cannot tell you. My job is only to operate this way station, to process the loads that fall through the cracks, and to offer drivers the choice. But I can tell you that everyone who has accepted the truth and moved forward has done so with peace, while everyone who returned to the highway carries their fear and denial like cargo that grows heavier with every mile." Daniel thought about his daughter, remembering her speech at the funeral he had not attended because he had been here, trapped in denial. He thought about his ex-wife, who despite everything had cared enough to say goodbye. He thought about his dispatcher, who would need to find a new driver for this route. The world was moving on without him because the world always moved on. The only question was whether Daniel would move with it or remain frozen in this moment forever. He looked at the inspector one final time. "I am ready," he said. The inspector nodded, made a notation on his clipboard. "Then your cargo is cleared for final delivery." The way station began to change around Daniel. The harsh lights dimmed to something softer and warmer. The concrete beneath his feet felt less solid, as if he were standing on ground that was willing to let him pass through. His truck, his cargo, the impossible items from his past, all began to fade like photographs left too long in sunlight. The last thing Daniel saw before the way station vanished completely was a new truck pulling in, its lights bright in the darkness. Another driver who had died without accepting it, arriving for their first inspection at a station between places. The inspector was already walking toward them, clipboard in hand, preparing to offer the same choice Daniel had been offered 43 times before finally finding the courage to accept. And Daniel understood with his final moment of consciousness in this liminal space that the inspector was not a demon or a monster. He was a mercy, a chance for the dead to let go. Some took that chance immediately. Others, like Daniel, needed dozens of opportunities before they were ready. And some would drive forever, unable to accept that their journey had ended, trapped in an eternal way station where their cargo would never be approved and their route would never be completed. Lisa had been hauling freight through Wyoming for 5 years, ever since her divorce left her needing a fresh start and a career that would keep her moving. At 32 years old, she had found unexpected fulfillment in the solitary life of long-haul trucking, spending weeks at a time on the road and returning home to Denver only when mandatory rest periods required it. The I-80 corridor through southern Wyoming was one of her regular routes, familiar and reliable, even during the harsh winter months, when wind and snow made the driving treacherous. It was just past 10 in the evening on a cold February night when the voice first came through her CB radio. Lisa had been driving through a particularly desolate stretch between Rawlins and Laramie, with nothing visible in any direction except snow-covered prairie stretching to distant mountains barely visible against the starlit sky. The CB had been quiet for the past hour, with occasional bursts of static, but no other drivers on the channel. "Lisa," the voice said clearly, cutting through the static with startling clarity. "You need to listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you. Do not stop at the rest area at mile marker 217. No matter what you see, no matter what appears to need your help, do not stop. Keep driving. Your life depends on it." Lisa's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart rate immediately accelerating. The voice was male, middle-aged, with a tone of desperate urgency that made the warning feel genuine, despite the impossibility of a stranger knowing her name. She grabbed her CB microphone with one hand, while maintaining control of her truck with the other. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" The voice continued without acknowledging her question. "You are driving a freight liner hauling automotive parts from Salt Lake City to Omaha. Your company is Mountain West Transport. Your daughter Emily is 8 years old and staying with your mother in Denver while you are on this run. You called her before you left Rawlins and promised to bring her a souvenir from the road. These details prove I know exactly who you are, and you need to trust that my warning is real." Lisa felt ice spreading through her chest. Everything the voice had said was accurate, including details about her daughter that she had not discussed with anyone except family. She checked her CB display to see what channel the transmission was coming from, but the radio showed only static on the frequency, despite the clear voice in her speakers. "Who are you?" Lisa demanded, again. "How do you know about my daughter?" "That does not matter right now," the voice replied. "What matters is that you are approaching mile marker 217, and something is waiting there for you. The rest area will appear normal. The lights will be on. You might even see other vehicles parked there. But if you stop, you will not leave. I am trying to prevent what happened to me from happening to you." Lisa's GPS showed she was currently at mile marker 193, which meant she was approximately 24 miles from the location the voice was warning her about. She knew the rest area he mentioned, a standard highway facility with restrooms, picnic tables, and parking for both commercial and passenger vehicles. She had stopped there dozens of times during previous runs, without incident. "You are insane," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am calling the highway patrol about this harassment." The voice responded with something that sounded like bitter laughter. "The highway patrol cannot help you. They do not believe in what waits at mile marker 217. They have investigated disappearances from that rest area for years and found nothing because they do not know how to see what is really there." I did not believe either, until it was too late. Now I am trying to warn everyone who drives this route. But most people ignore me just like you are doing right now. Lisa changed her CB channel, trying to find other drivers who might be hearing the same transmission. But when she switched frequencies, the voice followed her, speaking on every channel with the same clarity and urgency. She tried turning the volume down, but the voice maintained the same audible level regardless of her adjustments. When she turned the CB radio completely off, the voice continued speaking through the dead speakers, impossible but undeniable. "You cannot escape the warning by turning off your radio," the voice said. "I am not broadcasting through normal channels. I exist in the space between signals, trapped in the electromagnetic spectrum, trying to reach anyone who will listen. My name was Richard Coleman. I drove for Western Freight Lines. 5 years ago, I stopped at mile marker 217 because I saw what looked like an accident. People waving for help, a car on fire. Everything about the scene looked real and urgent. So I stopped, and I have been trying to warn others ever since." Lisa felt her skepticism warring with genuine fear. The voice sounded too sincere, too specific, too aware of details it should not have known. She checked her location again and saw she was approaching mile marker 200, with only 17 miles remaining until she reached the warned location. The highway ahead looked completely normal, empty of traffic in both directions, with occasional lights from distant ranch buildings providing the only signs of civilization in the vast darkness. As she drove, Lisa tried multiple times to trace the source of the CB transmission using techniques she had learned from other drivers. She switched channels rapidly, trying to triangulate the signal. She adjusted her antenna and checked her radio's diagnostic functions. Nothing explained how the voice was reaching her through a radio that was now unplugged from its power source, sitting silent on her dashboard while the voice continued to speak through its speakers. "What is waiting at the rest area?" Lisa finally asked, deciding that engaging with the voice might provide useful information even if the warning proved to be a hoax. "What happens if I stop?" The voice paused for a long moment before responding. "I do not know how to explain it in ways that will make sense. It looks like people needing help. It looks like a situation where any decent human being would stop to render assistance. But it is not real. It is a trap. Something that feeds on travelers who stop. Something that takes them out of normal reality and keeps them. I can still see the highway from where I am. I can still monitor CB channels and try to warn drivers. But I cannot leave. I have been trapped for 5 years, watching other trucks stop despite my warnings, seeing drivers disappear the same way I disappeared. Mile marker 210 appeared in Lisa's headlights. 7 miles to go. Her truck was running perfectly, her fuel was adequate, and she had no legitimate reason to stop at the rest area. But the voice's warning had planted a seed of dread that grew with every passing mile marker. Mile marker 215 passed on Lisa's right, the reflective numbers glowing bright in her headlights before disappearing into darkness behind her. 2 miles to go. The CB voice had gone silent for the past few minutes, leaving only the hum of her diesel engine and the whisper of tires on cold asphalt. Lisa's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, and she forced herself to relax slightly while maintaining her focus on the road ahead. Mile marker 216 appeared, then vanished. 1 mile remaining. Lisa could see the rest area now in the distance, its lights creating a bubble of illumination against the black Wyoming night. From this distance, everything looked completely normal, exactly as she remembered from previous stops. Standard highway department lighting, the distinctive angular roof of the restroom building, the parking area designed to accommodate multiple trucks and passenger vehicles. Then she saw the accident scene, and her foot moved instinctively toward the brake pedal. A passenger car was stopped sideways across the rest area entrance, its hazard lights flashing in urgent rhythm. 2 people stood in the headlights, waving their arms frantically, their movements suggesting panic and desperation. Behind them, Lisa could see what appeared to be another vehicle partially off the road, possibly rolled or crashed into the ditch. The scene looked exactly like a dozen real accidents Lisa had encountered during her years on the road, situations where stopping to help was not just the right thing to do, but often the difference between life and death for people in genuine distress. "Do not stop!" The CB voice exploded through her speakers with such volume and desperation that Lisa jerked in her seat. "Lisa, it is not real. Those are not people. That is what it shows you to make you stop. Keep driving. For God's sake, keep driving." But Lisa could see the people clearly now as her truck approached. A woman in a winter coat, her face twisted with fear and urgency. A man beside her, blood visible on his face and hands, waving both arms above his head in the universal signal for emergency assistance. Behind them, the crashed vehicle with what might have been someone still trapped inside. Smoke or steam rising from its damaged hood. Every instinct screamed at Lisa to stop. Every lesson about human decency and moral responsibility insisted that driving past people in obvious distress was unconscionable. Company policy explicitly required drivers to stop and render aid at accident scenes, to call for emergency services, to do whatever was necessary to help those in need. "Lisa, please." The voice was begging now, all pretense of calm authority abandoned. "I know what you are seeing. I saw the exact same thing 5 years ago. A woman with a child, waving for help, their car on fire. It looked so real I could smell the smoke. But when I stopped and got out of my truck, everything changed. The people were not people. The accident was not an accident. And I have been trapped here ever since, unable to leave, unable to do anything except try to warn others before they make the same mistake I made." Lisa's truck was now passing mile marker 217, her speed dropping as her foot hovered over the brake pedal, torn between the warning and the apparent emergency ahead. She could see more details now. The woman's mouth moving as she shouted words Lisa could not hear through her closed windows. The man stumbling slightly as if injured or in shock. The steam or smoke growing thicker around the crashed vehicle. Then her trailer lurched violently, and a loud bang echoed through the cab. Lisa's truck pulled hard to the right, the steering wheel fighting her control. The dashboard warning lights blazed to life, and her tire pressure monitoring system displayed a critical alert. Trailer tire failure. Right rear dual wheels. The flat tire she had been dreading for months, the one she knew was coming because the tread had been getting thin, had chosen this exact moment and this exact location to fail. "No, no, 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 no." The CB voice was screaming now, words tumbling over each other in desperate panic. "Not here. Not at this mile marker. Lisa, you have to keep driving on the flat. Destroy the tire, destroy the rim, destroy the whole axle if you have to, but do not stop here." Company policy was absolute and non-negotiable. Drivers discovering tire failure were required to stop immediately and safely, to activate hazard lights, to call for roadside assistance. Continuing to drive on a failed tire was grounds for immediate termination and potential loss of commercial driving privileges. Insurance would not cover damage caused by operating a vehicle after discovering a safety issue. The people at the rest area entrance had changed their gestures, now pointing at Lisa's trailer where smoke was beginning to rise from the destroyed tire, grinding against asphalt. They were running toward her truck now, their movements frantic, clearly trying to alert her to the emergency she had not yet addressed. "Lisa, listen to my voice," the CB transmission said, forcing calm into words that trembled with suppressed terror. "My name is Richard Coleman. I drove for Western Freight Lines out of Portland. On February 7th, 5 years ago, I stopped at this exact rest area because I saw an accident. A woman with a child. I am a father. I have 2 daughters. I could not drive past a child in danger. But when I stopped and opened my door, the woman's face changed. The child was not a child. And the reality I thought I understood stopped making sense. The smoke from Lisa's destroyed tire was thicker now, and she could smell burning rubber even through her closed cab. Her truck's systems were screaming multiple warnings, demanding she stop immediately before catastrophic damage occurred. The people from the accident scene were close now. Close enough that Lisa could see their expressions clearly through her passenger window. And in that moment of clarity, with her foot still hovering over the brake pedal, Lisa saw what the CB voice had been trying to make her understand. The woman's face was too perfect, too symmetrical, like a photograph rather than a living person. The man's movements were slightly wrong, his gestures too smooth and coordinated, like an animation that was almost but not quite realistic enough to pass for human. And the smoke from the crashed vehicle was not rising naturally, but flowing in patterns that defied physics, moving in directions that wine could not explain. "What are they?" Lisa whispered into her CB microphone, her truck still rolling forward at reduced speed, smoke pouring from her damaged trailer. The voice responded immediately, the relief in his tone palpable even through the electronic distortion. "I do not know what they are. I only know they are not human, and this rest area is not what it appears to be. If you stop, you will discover what I discovered. That mile marker 217 exists slightly outside normal reality. That something uses this location to trap travelers. That once you acknowledge the trap by stopping, you cannot leave." The people had stopped running toward Lisa's truck and now stood motionless, watching her pass. Their faces showed no expression now, no urgency, no emotion at all. They simply watched as her damaged truck limped past the rest area entrance, trailing smoke and destroying what remained of her tire with every rotation. "Keep going," the voice urged softly. "Another 5 miles and you will be clear of the zone. The tire is already destroyed. Another 5 miles will not make it worse. But stopping here will cost you everything." Lisa pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling her truck respond sluggishly but still moving forward. In her mirrors, she could see the rest area receding behind her, the people still standing motionless at the entrance, no longer pretending to need help now that their trap had failed. The smoke from her tire created a trail marking her passage. And somewhere behind that smoke, Lisa knew there were other trucks parked at that rest area, their drivers trapped by whatever force controlled that impossible space between mile markers. Mile marker 218 appeared ahead, and Lisa felt something shift in the air around her, as if she had passed through an invisible membrane separating 2 versions of reality. The CB voice spoke again, and this time there was something that might have been hope mixed with the exhaustion. "You did it. Richard said quietly. You are the first person in 5 years to listen to my warning and keep driving. Maybe that means something. Maybe that means there is still hope for the rest of us trapped here. Lisa drove for 5 more agonizing miles as her destroyed tire disintegrated beneath the trailer. The rubber peeled away in strips, then chunks, then finally shredded completely until she was riding on bare rim grinding against asphalt. Sparks flew from the metal-on-pavement contact, creating a cascade of orange light in her mirrors that looked almost festive against the dark Wyoming landscape. The sound was horrific, a screaming shriek of tortured metal that made her teeth ache and her hands cramp from gripping the steering wheel. Through it all, she kept her eyes on the mirrors, watching the rest area disappear behind her into darkness. The people who had been standing at the entrance were no longer just standing. They were moving now, following her truck at a speed that should have been impossible for human legs. They ran with fluid coordination, their bodies changing as they pursued her, becoming elongated and wrong, their limbs bending at joints that did not exist on human anatomy. Richard's voice came through the CB speakers, calm now but strained. Do you see them changing? Do you see what they really are when they stop pretending? Lisa could not form words to respond. She could only watch in frozen horror as the pursuing figures transformed further. Their faces stretched and split, revealing something underneath that looked like layers of images superimposed on each other. Hundreds of faces from different people flickering in rapid succession. Their clothing dissolved into patterns that hurt to look at. Geometric shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than her eyes could properly process. They cannot follow you far, Richard said. Maybe a mile, maybe 2. Once you are clear of their range, they have to return to the rest area and wait for the next traveler. Keep driving. You are almost safe. The pursuing figures were falling behind now, their impossible speed diminishing as if they had reached some invisible boundary they could not cross. Lisa watched them slow to a stop exactly at mile marker 221, then turn and walk back toward the rest area with movements that had become completely inhuman. They moved like insects or spiders, their bodies articulating in ways that made Lisa's stomach turn. Then they were gone, swallowed by darkness, and Lisa was alone on the highway, with only the screaming of her destroyed rim and the voice on her CB radio for company. She drove another 3 miles before reaching a legitimate truck stop, a 24-hour facility with bright lights and a parking lot full of trucks from various companies. Lisa pulled in with her hazard lights flashing, the sparks from her bare rim drawing attention from other drivers who emerged from their cabs to see what kind of emergency had brought a truck in with such catastrophic damage. The CB voice spoke one last time as Lisa shut down her engine. "Thank you for listening," Richard said softly. "You are alive because you trusted a warning from someone you could not see. I hope that means something. I hope that means I still serve some purpose even though I am trapped here. Be safe, Lisa. Tell your daughter Emily that you love her. Tell her every day." The transmission ended with a click, and when Lisa tried to respond, she got only static on every channel. Richard's voice was gone as completely as if it had never existed. Lisa spent the next hour dealing with the immediate crisis of her destroyed tire and damaged rim. She called her dispatcher, explained the situation with carefully chosen words that omitted any mention of supernatural warnings or impossible entities. She called roadside assistance and arranged for emergency repairs. She completed the required safety reports, documenting the tire failure but saying nothing about why she had continued driving on the flat for 8 miles. While she waited for the repair truck to arrive, Lisa went into the truck stop's restaurant and asked other drivers if they had ever heard CB transmissions warning about mile marker 217. Most looked at her like she was crazy. But one older driver, a man in his 60s with decades of experience evident in his weathered face, set down his coffee and leaned forward. "Richard Coleman," the old driver said quietly. "Drove for Western Freight Lines. Disappeared 5 years ago on I-80 in Wyoming. They found his truck abandoned at a rest area near mile marker 217. Engine still running, logbook open to his current entry, coffee still warm in the cup holder. No signs of struggle or foul play. No blood, no evidence of violence. He just vanished like he had stepped out to use the restroom and never came back." The old driver pulled out his phone and searched for news articles, showing Lisa the stories about Richard Coleman's disappearance. The photographs showed a man in his early 40s, smiling in his company uniform, with a wife and 2 daughters in family pictures. The articles described an extensive search involving law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and volunteers who found absolutely nothing. "He is not the only one," the old driver continued. 7 other drivers have disappeared from that same rest area over the past 15 years. Different companies, different schedules, different reasons for stopping. But all of them vanished completely, leaving their trucks behind with no explanation. Highway Patrol investigated every disappearance as a potential crime scene, but they found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no bodies. Eventually, they started attributing the disappearances to drivers who wanted to abandon their old lives and start over somewhere new. Lisa felt ice spreading through her veins. What do other drivers say about that rest area? The old driver's expression darkened. Most drivers avoid it. Word spreads on the CB channels. People report strange transmissions from that area, voices warning them not to stop. Some claim to see accident scenes that vanish when they get close. But nobody has proof, and anyone who talks about it too openly gets labeled as crazy or unreliable. So we just quietly avoid mile marker 217 and hope we never have a legitimate reason to stop there. Lisa returned to her truck and checked her dashboard camera footage, the recording system that captured continuous video of her driving for insurance and safety purposes. She fast-forwarded to the section where she passed mile marker 217, expecting to see the accident scene, the people waving for help, the pursuing figures that had chased her truck. The footage showed nothing. Empty highway, normal darkness, the rest area visible in the distance with its lights on, but no vehicles, no people, no accident scene. The video showed her truck maintaining speed, showed the moment her tire failed, showed her continuing to drive despite the obvious damage. But it showed none of the supernatural elements she had witnessed with her own eyes. Lisa sat in her cab and called her mother, asked to speak to Emily, told her 8-year-old daughter that she loved her more than anything in the world. Emily asked when Mommy would be home, and Lisa promised it would be soon, that she would bring the souvenir she had promised, that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. Lisa had escaped something at mile marker 217, but Richard Coleman and 7 other drivers had not been so fortunate. They were still there, trapped in whatever impossible space existed at that cursed rest area, trying to warn other travelers while being unable to save themselves. Over the following weeks, Lisa made her regular runs through Wyoming, always taking routes that avoided I-80 near mile marker 217. But late at night, when she was alone on dark highways in other states, her CB radio would sometimes activate by itself, and Richard's voice would come through the speakers. Not speaking to her directly, but broadcasting general warnings to anyone who might be listening, describing the trap at mile marker 217 and begging drivers to keep moving no matter what they saw. Other truckers started reporting similar experiences. Warnings from Richard Coleman on CB channels that should have been empty. Descriptions of accident scenes that vanished when approached. Advice to keep driving past mile marker 217 under any circumstances. The story spread through the trucking community like folklore, half believed and fully feared. Lisa eventually learned through the driver grapevine that 2 more truckers had disappeared from the rest area at mile marker 217 in the months after her encounter. Both had stopped despite CB warnings they reportedly received. Both had been found abandoned in the rest area parking lot with no sign of their drivers. The official investigations turned up nothing, and both disappearances were eventually classified as voluntary abandonments by drivers who wanted to disappear. But Lisa knew better. She knew those drivers were now trapped in the same electromagnetic prison that held Richard Coleman, their voices joining his in trying to warn the next traveler, the next potential victim, the next truck approaching mile marker 217 on a dark Wyoming night. And she knew that someday, perhaps years from now, her own voice might join that chorus if she ever made the mistake of stopping at that cursed rest area, adding her warnings to the others, hoping that eventually someone would listen and the cycle might finally be broken. But until then, she would keep driving, keep telling her daughter she loved her, and keep her CB radio turned up loud enough to hear the warnings from those who had stopped when they should have kept moving. Robert had been driving the Pacific Northwest routes for 13 years, hauling lumber and building materials from mills in Oregon and Washington to construction sites across the western states. At 46 years old, he was a veteran of mountain passes, coastal fog, and the unpredictable weather that made the region both beautiful and treacherous. He prided himself on his independence, preferring to drive alone rather than coordinate with other truckers, maintaining his own schedule and his own pace without the complications of convoy arrangements. It was approaching 11 in the evening on a moonless Saturday in late October when he first noticed the convoy forming around him. Robert was driving south on Highway 97 through Central Oregon, following a route that would take him from Bend toward the California border. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, cutting through forest and high desert with minimal traffic in either direction. He had not seen another commercial vehicle for nearly an hour. The first truck appeared in his mirrors without warning, closing distance rapidly from behind. Robert maintained his speed at 67 miles per hour, expecting the other driver to pass when ready. But instead of overtaking him, the truck matched his speed exactly and settled into position perhaps 50 yards behind. Close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough to maintain safe following distance. Within minutes, a second truck appeared ahead of him on the highway, having apparently been traveling slower until Robert caught up. This truck also matched his speed precisely, staying about 100 yards in front. Then 2 more trucks materialized from side roads or exits Robert had not noticed, taking positions on either side of him in the adjacent lanes. A 5th truck completed the formation by moving up alongside the truck behind him, creating a perfect box with Robert's vehicle at the center. The coordination was impressive but unsettling. Robert had participated in informal convoys before, groups of truckers traveling together for company and safety on long hauls. But those arrangements were casual and flexible, with vehicles drifting in and out of formation as speeds varied and drivers took breaks. This formation was rigid and precise, with all 5 trucks maintaining exact positions relative to his vehicle as if they were connected by invisible cables. Robert tried to accelerate, testing whether the other trucks would allow him to break free from the formation. His speedometer climbed to 75, then 80, speeds that were dangerous on this winding mountain highway. The convoy matched his acceleration perfectly, every truck increasing speed in synchronized coordination that kept him boxed in at the center of their formation. When he slowed back to 60, they slowed with him, maintaining the same precise distances. He reached for his CB radio, intending to ask the other drivers what they were doing and why they had him boxed in. Before he could key his microphone, voices crackled through his speakers, transmissions between the convoy trucks using codes and terminology he did not recognize. Unit 3 confirming position at Mark 773, a male voice said. Target maintaining course. Vector stable. Unit 5 acknowledging, another voice responded. Deviation minimal. Proceed to waypoint Echo. Robert broke into their transmission. This is the truck in the center of your formation. I do not know what you are doing, but I need you to let me pass or fall back. You are making me uncomfortable. The voices on the CB continued as if he had not spoken, discussing coordinates and waypoints in language that sounded military or perhaps aviation-related rather than normal trucker communication. Robert tried multiple channels, searching for frequencies where he might reach the convoy drivers without the coded interference. Every channel produced the same transmissions, the same coordinates being called out and confirmed with mechanical precision. Unit 2 reporting anomaly at Vector 315, a female voice said. Atmospheric distortion increasing. Prepare for phase transition. What the hell are you people talking about? Robert shouted into his microphone. Let me out of this formation. The truck ahead of him activated its turn signal and began moving toward an exit that Robert did not remember from previous trips on this highway. The entire convoy shifted in perfect synchronization, guiding him toward the exit with movements so coordinated they seemed choreographed. Robert tried to maintain his course on the main highway, but the trucks boxing him in left no room to maneuver. He was being herded like cattle, forced to follow the convoy's predetermined route whether he wanted to or not. His steering wheel felt strange under his hands, as if it were responding to inputs he was not consciously making. When he tried to turn away from the exit, the wheel resisted his efforts with force that should have been impossible in a manual steering system. His truck followed the convoy off the highway onto a road his GPS did not show, heading into forest that grew denser and darker with each passing mile. The CB transmissions became more frequent and more incomprehensible as they drove deeper into the unmarked route. The voices discussed technical specifications, temporal coordinates, and dimensional parameters that made no sense in the context of commercial trucking. Robert's dashboard instruments began displaying impossible readings. His GPS showed his location as multiple contradictory positions simultaneously. His compass spun in slow circles, unable to lock onto any direction. The convoy maintained its perfect formation as they traveled down the forest road. 5 trucks surrounding Robert's vehicle in a configuration that felt less like transportation and more like imprisonment. Through his windows, Robert could see that the forest outside was changing, the trees becoming taller and more ancient than any growth that should have existed in managed Oregon timberland. The darkness between the trunks seemed absolute, as if light itself was being absorbed by something lurking in the depths. After driving for what felt like an hour on the unmarked road, the convoy emerged into a clearing that made Robert's mind struggle to process what his eyes were showing him. Dozens of trucks sat in perfect rows, arranged with geometric precision that suggested military organization or perhaps something even more systematic and inhuman. The vehicles represented decades of automotive design, from ancient models that should have been in museums to current-year trucks identical to his own. The convoy came to a synchronized stop in the clearing, all 6 trucks, including Robert's, halting at the exact same moment, despite no visible coordination signal. The engines continued running, their combined rumble creating a low-frequency vibration that Robert could feel in his chest like a second heartbeat. Through his windshield, he could see the facility that occupied the center of the clearing, a complex of buildings that looked like an abandoned truck depot or distribution center from decades past. The structures were concrete and steel, built in an architectural style Robert associated with the 1950s or 60s. with the kind of utilitarian design that prioritized function over aesthetics. Loading docks lined the main building, their bay doors standing open to reveal dark interiors illuminated by flickering lights that should not have been functioning in an abandoned facility. The entire complex looked like it had been frozen in time, preserved perfectly despite obvious decades of neglect. Robert tried his door handle and found it would not respond. He pulled harder, then kicked at the door, but the mechanism refused to open. His windows would not roll down despite the manual override controls that should have worked even with electrical failure. He was locked inside his own cab, trapped in a truck that had somehow stopped responding to his commands. Through his mirrors, he watched the other convoy trucks begin to move again, not back toward the forest road, but deeper into the facility, toward specific parking spaces in the geometric rows of vehicles. Robert's truck started moving too, rolling forward without his foot on the accelerator, steering itself toward an empty space in the orderly array. He grabbed the wheel and tried to turn, but the truck ignored his input completely, following a predetermined path like a carnival ride on fixed tracks. His truck backed into position between two other semis, fitting perfectly into a space that seemed specifically prepared for his vehicle. The engine shut off without Robert touching the key, and suddenly the door locks clicked open with a sound that made him flinch. He sat frozen for a moment, staring at the door handle that now worked perfectly, wondering whether opening it would make his situation better or infinitely worse. Figures emerged from the facility buildings and from between the parked trucks, moving toward the newly arrived convoy with purposeful coordination. Robert's first impression was that they looked like normal truckers, men and women in work clothes and company uniforms, going about the routine business of loading and unloading cargo. But as they came closer and the flickering lights illuminated them more clearly, he saw details that made his breath catch in his throat. Their movements were slightly wrong, just subtle enough to trigger discomfort without being obviously inhuman. They walked with mechanical precision, their steps measured and exact, like people following choreographed routines rather than natural gait. Their faces showed limited expressions, smiles that did not reach their eyes, attention that seemed focused on tasks rather than social interaction with each other. More disturbing was the way they dressed. Their clothing represented different eras spanning at least 5 decades. Some wore uniforms from trucking companies Robert recognized as having gone out of business in the 1970s. Others had patches and logos from more recent companies, including one man whose jacket bore the name of a firm Robert knew had filed bankruptcy just 2 years ago. All of the clothing looked clean and well-maintained despite its obvious age. A woman approached Robert's truck, her uniform identifying her as a driver for Pacific Express Lines, a company Robert's father had worked for in the 1980s before its acquisition and dissolution. She smiled up at him through the window, her expression pleasant but empty, and gestured for him to exit the vehicle. When Robert did not move, she simply waited with infinite patience, her smile never wavering, her posture suggesting she could stand there forever if necessary. Robert finally opened his door and climbed down, his legs unsteady after the hours of driving and the shock of his situation. The woman nodded approvingly and began walking toward the main facility building, clearly expecting him to follow. All around the clearing, the other convoy trucks were being serviced by the mysterious figures, cargo being unloaded with efficient choreography that spoke of endless practice. "What is this place?" Robert asked, his voice sounding too loud in the strange atmosphere of the clearing. The woman turned to look at him, her empty smile still in place. "This is the waypoint," she said in a voice that had the right words but wrong intonation, as if English was a second language she had learned phonetically. "This is where we continue our routes, where we maintain our schedules, where we deliver our cargo to destinations that exist between the places you know. Robert looked at the trucks parked in perfect rows and began to notice additional details that made horror creep up his spine like ice water. Some of the vehicles had company logos from firms he knew had disappeared mysteriously, their trucks and drivers vanishing without explanation. Others bore the names of legendary ghost trucks from trucker folklore, vehicles that supposedly drove phantom routes and appeared in impossible locations. One truck in particular caught his attention, a Peterbilt from the late 1960s with distinctive custom paintwork he recognized from a famous unsolved case. In 1973, that truck and its driver had vanished while hauling cargo from Seattle to Portland, last seen at a way station and never arriving at the delivery destination. The case had become legend in trucking circles, one of dozens of mysterious disappearances that were attributed to everything from organized crime to alien abduction. Now here it sat, perfectly maintained, as if it had been making deliveries for the past 50 years in this hidden facility where time seemed to function differently. "You are all the missing drivers," Robert said, understanding finally clicking into place. "The ones who disappeared over the decades. You are all here, still driving, still making your routes." The woman's smile widened slightly, the only change in her expression since he had first seen her. "We never stopped," she said. "We continued our schedules. The cargo must be delivered. The routes must be completed. This is what we do. This is who we are." Robert watched as cargo was unloaded from the convoy trucks, boxes and crates that seemed to shift and change as they were moved, their contents never quite visible even when partially exposed. The cargo was being sorted and transferred to other trucks that would presumably deliver it to destinations Robert could not imagine. The entire operation ran with industrial efficiency, dozens of vanished drivers working in perfect coordination to maintain supply lines that served purposes beyond his comprehension. "How long have you been here?" Robert asked the woman. "When did you disappear?" She tilted her head, considering the question as if it required complex calculation. "I arrived on March 7th, 1984. My route was Portland to Sacramento. I stopped to help what I thought was an accident victim on Highway 5. The victim brought me here. I have been completing my deliveries ever since." 40 years, Robert whispered. "You have been here for 40 years." The woman's expression did not change. "Time functions differently at the waypoint," she explained. "I have experienced perhaps 40 days, or 40 years, or 40 minutes. The measurement is not relevant to the work. The cargo must be delivered. The schedules must be maintained. You will understand soon." Other figures were approaching now, surrounding Robert with the same empty smiles and patient demeanor. They began guiding him toward the main facility building, their touches gentle but insistent, making it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Robert tried to pull away, but found his body responding sluggishly, as if the atmosphere of the waypoint was affecting his ability to control his own movements. Through the loading dock doors, he could see into the facility's interior. Conveyor systems moved cargo through processing areas where more lost drivers sorted and categorized items that seemed to exist in states between solid and liquid, between matter and energy. Computer systems that looked decades old displayed information in languages and symbols Robert did not recognize. Maps on the walls showed route networks connecting impossible destinations, highways that linked places from different times and possibly different realities. "This is where you will complete your deliveries," the woman said, still smiling her empty smile. "This is where you will join the permanent convoy. This is where you will drive forever, maintaining the supply lines between worlds that exist in the spaces between your reality. You will never be tired, never hungry, never late with a delivery. You will be perfect, like all of us. serving the waypoint for eternity. Robert was led deeper into the facility, past rows of drivers who worked with mechanical dedication at tasks he could not fully understand. Some were maintaining trucks, others processing cargo, still others studying route maps and schedules that described journeys through dimensions he had never imagined existed. All of them wore the same empty smile, the same distant expression, the same evidence of having surrendered their humanity to become components in a machine dedicated to incomprehensible purposes. The woman led Robert to a processing station where other lost drivers waited with clipboards and scanning devices, ready to integrate him into their eternal operations. One of the men reached for Robert's logbook, the paper record every trucker was required to maintain. Robert handed it over automatically, his mind still struggling to process the nightmare reality of the Waypoint facility. The man opened the logbook and froze, his empty smile faltering for the first time. He flipped through the pages with increasing speed, his movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. The other drivers gathered around, examining the logbook with expressions that shifted from their usual blank contentment to something approaching confusion and distress. "This is wrong," the man said, his voice losing its mechanical quality and taking on tones of genuine emotion. "This logbook is current. Today's date, recent entries. This driver is not lost. He is still connected to the real-time stream." The woman who had brought Robert inside snatched the logbook and studied it herself, her face contorting with an expression Robert could not quite identify. She turned to examine Robert more closely, as if seeing him for the first time as something other than just another lost trucker to be processed and integrated. "Check his cargo manifest," she ordered, her voice sharp with authority that had been absent in her earlier mechanical pleasantness. Another driver ran to Robert's truck and retrieved his paperwork, returning with the bills of lading and cargo documentation that described his current load. The documents were passed between the gathered drivers, each one examining them with growing agitation. Their movements became less synchronized, less mechanical, as if Robert's presence was disrupting whatever force controlled their behavior. "His cargo is real," someone announced, voice filled with something that might have been despair. "Legitimate deliveries to actual destinations, current addresses, living recipients. He is not carrying phantom loads to impossible places. He does not belong here." The atmosphere in the facility began to change. The flickering lights started pulsing with more erratic rhythm. The low-frequency vibration that permeated the complex shifted to a higher pitch that made Robert's teeth ache. All around him, the lost drivers were becoming agitated, their empty smiles replaced by expressions of panic and confusion. Robert's logbook and manifest were creating a cascade effect, reminding the trapped drivers of what they had lost. Some of them pulled out their own logbooks, decades old, filled with entries describing routes to destinations that had never existed or places that had been demolished years before their disappearances. Their cargo manifests listed items impossible to transport, abstract concepts given physical form, deliveries to locations existing only in the spaces between realities. One driver, a man whose uniform identified him as having worked for a company dissolved in 1992, began weeping as he compared his logbook to Robert's. "I was real once," he said, his voice breaking. "I had a family. I had a home. I had a life beyond these endless routes. What happened to me? How long have I been here?" The waypoint itself seemed to be reacting to Robert's presence, the walls of the facility vibrating with increasing intensity. The cargo being processed on the conveyor systems began shifting more rapidly between states, becoming less stable, less defined. Maps on the walls flickered and changed, route networks dissolving and reforming in patterns that made Robert's eyes hurt to observe. "He does not belong," the woman said again, but now her voice carried fear rather than confidence. His connection to real time is corrupting the temporal stability of the waypoint. He must be expelled before his presence destabilizes the entire operation. The gathered drivers began moving away from Robert, creating a widening circle of empty space around him. Their movements were no longer coordinated, but panicked. Individuals rather than components of a machine. Some were pulling out old photographs from their wallets, pictures of families they had not seen in decades, crying as they remembered lives they had forgotten. The facility's reaction intensified. The floor beneath Robert's feet began to feel less solid, as if reality itself was rejecting his presence. The walls became translucent, showing glimpses of the forest outside and something beyond the forest. Multiple versions of the landscape overlapping and interfering with each other. The lost drivers were screaming now, some begging Robert to help them escape, others demanding he leave before his presence destroyed the only existence they remembered. A force Robert could not see began pushing him backward, away from the processing area, back toward the loading docks where his truck waited. He tried to resist, tried to reach for the crying drivers who were remembering their humanity. But the invisible pressure was too strong. His feet left marks in the concrete floor as he was dragged inexorably toward his vehicle. The woman who had first greeted him stood in his path one final time, her expression no longer empty, but filled with desperate longing. "Tell them we are here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Tell them the missing drivers are trapped at the waypoint. Tell them we want to go home. Tell them before we forget again and return to the routes that have no ending." Then Robert was outside, the facility doors slamming shut behind him with force that shook the ground. His truck's engine started by itself, and the steering wheel turned under invisible control, guiding him away from the clearing back toward the forest road. The other convoy trucks followed, but now they moved with individual variation rather than perfect synchronization, their drivers struggling to maintain formation, as if whatever force had controlled them was weakening. The journey back through the forest took only minutes, though the trip inward had felt like hours. Reality stabilized around Robert as he emerged onto the main highway, his GPS immediately showing his correct location, his radio picking up normal trucker channels. The convoy trucks that had forced him to the waypoint dispersed quickly, each taking different exits and routes as if desperate to escape his presence. Robert drove straight through to his delivery destination, unloading his cargo in a daze and accepting payment without really processing what was happening. He completed his paperwork mechanically, said nothing to anyone about where he had been or what he had witnessed. 3 days later, while stopped at a rest area in Northern California, Robert saw 5 trucks parked in the commercial vehicle section that made his heart stop. He recognized them immediately as the convoy that had forced him to the waypoint, identical down to their specific scratches and modifications. But now they were occupied by living drivers who appeared completely normal. Men and women drinking coffee and checking their phones like any other truckers taking mandatory rest breaks. Robert approached one of the drivers, a young man who could not have been older than 25. "Do you remember a facility in the Oregon forest?" Robert asked. "A place where trucks gather, where lost drivers make impossible deliveries." The young man looked at Robert with polite confusion. "I have never driven in Oregon," he said. "My roots are all California and Nevada. I just bought this truck 2 weeks ago from an estate sale." But Robert had seen the logbook lying open on the passenger seat, and in that brief glance, he caught entries dating back to 1987, describing routes that connected places from different decades. He saw cargo manifests listing deliveries to addresses that had been demolished before the young driver was born. He saw schedule notations referencing the waypoint and coordinates for locations that existed only in the spaces between realities. The young driver had no memory of these entries, no awareness that the truck he had purchased was still making its eternal routes through dimensions he could not perceive. He was simply a new component in an old machine. Another driver recruited to maintain supply lines that served purposes beyond human understanding. Robert walked back to his own truck, his hands shaking as he opened his logbook and found new entries he had not written. They described a delivery he had made to the waypoint, cargo he had unloaded there, payment he had received in currency that did not exist in normal reality. The entries were in his handwriting, but described events from a timeline that had been edited, adjusted, made to fit the waypoint's requirements. And Robert understood finally that he had not escaped at all. He had been rejected, expelled as incompatible with the waypoint's operations. But his brief time there had left marks that would never fade, connections that would never fully break. Some part of him remained at that facility, making deliveries in parallel to his conscious existence, serving routes that spanned dimensions while his waking mind completed normal hauls through normal reality. Late at night, driving through empty highways with only his thoughts for company, Robert would sometimes lose track of time and find himself dozens of miles past where he intended to be, with no memory of the journey. His logbook would show entries he did not remember making, describing deliveries to destinations he had never heard of. His cargo would sometimes shift and change when he was not looking, boxes containing items he had not loaded transforming into phantom goods meant for impossible recipients. He tried to warn other drivers about the convoy that recruited for the waypoint, but his warnings sounded like madness, even to his own ears. Most truckers ignored him or changed the subject. A few listened with the intense attention of people who had experienced similar impossibilities, who had glimpsed the machinery beneath reality and understood that some routes led to places that existed outside normal space and time. And Robert knew that eventually, perhaps in a year or a decade, the convoy would return for him. Next time, they would not reject him as incompatible. Next time his logbook would match theirs, his cargo manifest would list items that did not exist, and his connection to real time would be severed completely. He would join the permanent convoy, making eternal deliveries between dimensions, wearing the same empty smile as all the other lost drivers who had forgotten they were human and remembered only the routes that never ended.